The date was February 24th, 2022, and the world woke up to something it thought belonged in history books. Russian tanks crossed into Ukraine, and in that moment, everything Europe thought it knew about peace, security, and its own identity began to crumble. For over 70 years, the continent had built its future on a simple promise. Never again would European soil see the horrors of large-scale war. That promise shattered in a single morning. But here's what nobody expected. The war in Ukraine didn't just change Ukraine. It didn't just challenge Russia. It fundamentally transformed Europe itself, awakening a sleeping giant that had almost forgotten how to defend itself, forcing nations to choose sides they thought they'd never have to pick, and reshaping the entire strategic landscape from the Arctic Circle to the Mediterranean Sea. This is the story of how one conflict became the catalyst for the most dramatic transformation of Europe since the end of the Cold War, and why what happens next will determine the future of global security for generations to come. Let's go back to the beginning to understand just how much has changed. Before 2022, Europe was comfortable. Germany, the economic powerhouse of the continent, had built its entire energy infrastructure around cheap Russian gas. The Nord Stream pipelines weren't just business deals. They were symbols of a broader European belief that economic integration would prevent conflict. Trade, not tanks, would keep the peace. France maintained its traditional role as a diplomatic bridge between East and West, with President Macron regularly speaking to Putin, convinced that dialogue could resolve any crisis. Meanwhile, countries like Italy, Hungary, and Austria had developed deep economic and political ties with Moscow, viewing Russia as a partner rather than a threat. The European Union itself had spent decades focused on expansion and integration, bringing former Soviet bloc countries into its orbit through the promise of prosperity and democratic values. NATO, the military alliance that had won the Cold War without firing a shot, seemed almost like a relic. Defense budgets across Europe had been shrinking for years. Why spend money on tanks and missiles when there were hospitals to build and pensions to fund? The threat seemed distant, theoretical, something for policy papers rather than actual military planning. But there were warning signs that most chose to ignore. In 2008, Russia invaded Georgia, a small country in the Caucasus. The response was minimal, mostly diplomatic hand-wringing. In 2014, Russia annexed Crimea from Ukraine and fueled a separatist war in eastern Ukraine's Donbass region. This time, Europe imposed sanctions, but they were measured, careful not to disrupt the lucrative trade relationships too much. Germany continued building Nord Stream 2. French companies kept doing business in Russia. The general attitude was that Putin was testing boundaries, but that ultimately rational economic interests would prevail. Everyone believed that a full-scale invasion of Ukraine was simply unthinkable in 21st century Europe. Then came the shock. When Russian forces launched their invasion in February 2022, aiming to capture Kiev within days and install a puppet government, Europe faced a moment of reckoning. The initial response revealed just how unprepared the continent was. Military stockpiles were low. Command structures were rusty. Political will was uncertain. But something remarkable happened in those first few weeks. Ukrainian resistance, heroic and unexpected, gave Europe time to find its spine. President Zelensky's defiant refusal to flee Kiev became a rallying cry. His simple statement, "I need ammunition, not a ride," crystallized what was at stake. This wasn't just about Ukraine. This was about whether might makes right, whether borders could be redrawn by force, whether the entire post-World War II order still meant anything. Germany's transformation was perhaps the most dramatic. Chancellor Olaf Scholz announced what he called a Zeitenwende, a turning point. In a historic speech to the Bundestag just 3 days after the invasion, Scholz committed 100 billion euros to defense spending and pledged to meet NATO's target of spending 2% of GDP on defense, something Germany had resisted for years. The country that had built its identity on pacifism and economic power suddenly remembered it was also the largest economy in Europe with responsibilities to match. Germany began sending weapons to Ukraine, reversing a policy that had prohibited sending arms to conflict zones. It started the painful process of weaning itself off Russian energy, even though this meant economic hardship and tough choices about nuclear power and coal plants. Poland emerged as one of the most vocal supporters of Ukraine and one of the most forceful voices for a hard line against Russia. This wasn't surprising given Polish history, centuries of being caught between German and Russian power, decades under Soviet domination. Poland had never trusted Moscow, and now its warnings were being vindicated. The country opened its borders to millions of Ukrainian refugees, providing shelter, support, and integration assistance on a scale that put much of the rest of Europe to shame. Polish military aid flowed to Ukraine, including Soviet-era tanks and aircraft that Ukrainian forces knew how to operate. Warsaw became a crucial logistics hub for Western military assistance, with American and NATO equipment flowing through Polish territory to the front lines. The Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, felt the threat most acutely. They share borders with Russia and have significant Russian-speaking populations. They remembered Soviet occupation and the long struggle for independence. For them, Ukraine's fight was existential. If Ukraine fell, they could be next. These small nations punched above their weight, providing military aid as a percentage of GDP that dwarfed larger countries. They pushed for the strongest possible sanctions against Russia and advocated for Ukraine's rapid integration into European and NATO structures. They also invested heavily in their own defenses, building fortifications along their borders and hosting increased NATO troop deployments. Finland and Sweden made perhaps the most strategically significant decisions. Both countries had maintained policies of military non-alignment for decades. Finland had carefully balanced its relationship with Russia since World War II, maintaining neutrality as a buffer against Soviet and later Russian pressure. Sweden hadn't been in a military alliance since the Napoleonic era. But the invasion of Ukraine changed everything. Both countries applied to join NATO in 2022, a move that would have been politically impossible just months earlier. Finland's accession in 2023 doubled NATO's border with Russia and brought one of Europe's most capable militaries into the alliance. Sweden followed in 2024, adding advanced submarine capabilities and control over the Baltic Sea to NATO's strategic assets. The message to Moscow was clear: aggression doesn't intimidate, it unifies. France maintained its traditional role as a strategic thinker, with Macron continuing to argue for European strategic autonomy while also supporting Ukraine. This sometimes created tensions, particularly when Macron suggested that Europe shouldn't become a vassal of the United States, or when he spoke about not humiliating Russia. But France also provided significant military aid, including advanced artillery systems and air defense capabilities. The French defense industry ramped up production, recognizing that the security environment had fundamentally changed. The United Kingdom, no longer part of the European Union, but still a key European power, became one of Ukraine's strongest supporters. From the early days of the conflict, Britain provided anti-tank weapons, training, intelligence, and eventually tanks and long-range missiles. The UK helped galvanize international support and worked closely with Poland and the Baltic states to push for stronger Western responses. Brexit had created distance between Britain and continental Europe, but the Ukraine crisis showed that security concerns still bound them together. Southern European countries faced different calculations. Italy, heavily dependent on Russian gas and with political factions sympathetic to Moscow, initially wavered but ultimately joined the European consensus. Spain and Portugal, geographically distant from the conflict, nonetheless recognized the broader implications for European security. Greece, with its own historical ties to Russia through Orthodox Christianity, navigated between supporting Ukraine and maintaining some dialogue with Moscow. The most controversial position belonged to Hungary. Prime Minister Viktor Orbán maintained close ties with Putin, blocked some EU sanctions, and refused to send weapons to Ukraine. Hungary's position created friction within the EU and NATO, raising questions about alliance cohesion. But it also highlighted a broader debate about how far Europe should go in confronting Russia and at what economic and political cost. The energy crisis hit Europe hard. Russia's manipulation of gas supplies, reducing flows through pipelines, and eventually the sabotage of Nord Stream in September 2022 sent energy prices soaring. Governments scrambled to secure alternative supplies, building liquefied natural gas terminals at record speed, increasing imports from Norway, Qatar, and the United States. The winter of 2022 and 2023 became a test of European resilience. Would countries buckle under the economic pressure and force Ukraine into concessions? They didn't. Despite the hardship, despite protests and political pressure, Europe maintained its support for Ukraine and its sanctions against Russia. This energy shock accelerated Europe's transition to renewable energy. What climate activists had struggled to achieve through moral arguments, Putin achieved through blackmail. Solar and wind installations surged. Heat pumps replaced gas boilers. Energy efficiency became a national priority. The crisis revealed both Europe's vulnerability and its capacity to adapt. Germany, which had received 55% of its gas from Russia before the war, reduced this to zero within 18 months. It was painful, expensive, and politically difficult, but it happened. The military transformation extended beyond budgets to actual capabilities. European defense industries, which had been consolidating and shrinking for years, suddenly faced surging demand. Artillery ammunition, which seemed like a Cold War relic, became critical. Europe discovered it couldn't produce shells at anywhere near the rate needed. Ukrainian forces were firing thousands of rounds per day, burning through stockpiles that European militaries had assumed would last for years. This sparked a massive expansion of production capacity, with factories reopening and new facilities being built. NATO's eastern flank got serious reinforcement. The alliance activated its response force and deployed multinational battle groups to Poland, the Baltic states, Romania, and Bulgaria. These weren't token forces but serious combat units with tanks, artillery, and air defense systems. The United States increased its troop presence in Europe significantly, reversing years of drawdowns. American bombers conducted regular patrols near NATO's borders. The message was clear. Article 5, the Collective Defense Clause, was not symbolic but operational. Air defense became a priority across Europe. The threat of Russian missiles, demonstrated daily in Ukraine, prompted countries to invest in systems ranging from short-range anti-aircraft missiles to sophisticated long-range interceptors. Germany spearheaded a European air defense initiative, proposing an integrated system that would protect the entire continent. This represented a shift from national defense thinking to truly collective security architecture. Cybersecurity and information warfare moved to the forefront. Russian attempts to interfere in elections, spread disinformation, and hack critical infrastructure had been ongoing for years, but the war brought new urgency. European countries invested in cyber defense capabilities, shared intelligence more effectively, and worked to counter Russian propaganda narratives. The information space became as contested as physical territory, with both sides fighting for public opinion, not just in their own countries but globally. The refugee crisis tested European solidarity in different ways than 2015. This time, the response was overwhelmingly positive. Countries that had resisted accepting Syrian refugees welcomed Ukrainians. This was partly because of geographic and cultural proximity, partly because most Ukrainian refugees were women and children with men staying to fight, and partly because the cause seemed clearer. But it also revealed Europe's capacity for compassion and coordination when political will exists. Ukraine's defense also changed. What began as a desperate fight for survival evolved into a sophisticated military operation. Ukrainian forces, armed with Western weapons and trained by NATO instructors, demonstrated remarkable adaptability. They learned to use HIMARS rocket systems, Leopard tanks, Patriot air defenses, and F-16 fighters. They developed innovative tactics, combining commercial drones with traditional artillery, using social media for intelligence gathering, and exploiting Russian weaknesses with precision strikes deep behind enemy lines. The Ukrainian military became, in effect, a testing ground for modern warfare, providing lessons that European militaries studied intensively. The economic sanctions against Russia represented the most comprehensive effort of their kind ever attempted. Europe, the United States, and allies froze Russian central bank assets, cut major Russian banks from the SWIFT financial system, banned imports of Russian oil and gas, prohibited exports of advanced technology, and sanctioned thousands of individuals and companies. The goal was to cripple Russia's ability to fund its war machine. The results were mixed. Russia's economy contracted but didn't collapse. Putin found ways to circumvent sanctions, selling oil to China and India, smuggling goods through third countries, and maintaining enough revenue to continue the war. But the sanctions did impose real costs, limiting Russia's access to advanced components for weapons and forcing difficult economic choices. Europe's relationship with China became more complicated. Beijing's tacit support for Moscow, its refusal to condemn the invasion, and its continued economic partnership with Russia created tensions. European leaders who had viewed China primarily as an economic opportunity began to see it as a strategic challenge. The old model of separating economic engagement from security concerns looked increasingly naive. If China was willing to support Russia's war in Europe, What did that mean for Taiwan, for the South China Sea, for the global order? Europe started to align more closely with American concerns about China, though it remained more cautious about full decoupling. The European defense industry faced a reckoning. For years, Europe had talked about strategic autonomy, the ability to defend itself without depending on the United States. But the war revealed gaps. Europe depended on American intelligence, American logistics, American air power, and American political leadership. European weapons stocks were depleted rapidly. Production capacity was insufficient. The continent had become comfortable relying on American security guarantees without maintaining the hard power to back up its own interests. This sparked debates about European defense integration, about joint procurement programs, about building a true European defense industrial base. Progress was slow, hampered by national interests and bureaucratic complexity, but the direction was clear. NATO's relevance was reaffirmed dramatically. Critics had questioned whether the alliance was obsolete, whether it should expand its mission, whether it could maintain cohesion. The war answered those questions. NATO proved it could still deter aggression, coordinate complex military operations, and maintain political unity under pressure. The alliance's decision-making processes, often criticized as slow and consensus-driven, actually provided strength by ensuring all members were committed to the common approach. New members Finland and Sweden strengthened the alliance militarily and geographically. Ukraine's aspiration to join NATO became a central political question, with implications far beyond the immediate conflict. The war's impact on European politics was profound. In some countries, it strengthened centrist parties that took firm stances supporting Ukraine. In others, it empowered right-wing parties critical of immigration and economic costs. The far left struggled, torn between anti-American reflexes and opposition to Russian imperialism. Green parties found themselves supporting military spending and questioning pacifism. Traditional political alignments scrambled. The war became a litmus test, separating those who believed in defending democratic values with force if necessary from those who prioritized peace at almost any cost. Public opinion evolved in fascinating ways. Initial shock and solidarity gave way to fatigue as the war dragged on. Support for Ukraine remained strong in Poland, the Baltics, and Nordic countries. It became more contested in Germany, France, and Southern Europe, where economic concerns and war weariness created pressure for negotiated settlements. But even as fatigue grew, European publics showed greater acceptance of military spending and harder stances toward Russia than seemed imaginable before 2022. The nuclear question haunted European discussions. Russia's thinly veiled nuclear threats, its suspension of arms control treaties, and its deployment of tactical nuclear weapons to Belarus reminded everyone that this was not a conventional conflict between equals. Europe lived under the shadow of potential nuclear escalation. This reality shaped decisions about what weapons to provide Ukraine, how far to push sanctions, and whether to support Ukrainian strikes on Russian territory. The balance between supporting Ukraine and avoiding World War III was delicate and constantly debated. Europe's relationship with the United States deepened in some ways and became more complicated in others. American military support for Ukraine dwarfed Europe's contributions, reinforcing European dependence. American natural gas replaced Russian supplies. American political leadership rallied the coalition. But American domestic politics created uncertainty. What if a president less committed to European security took office? What if American attention shifted entirely to China? These questions drove European efforts toward greater autonomy, even as the immediate crisis increased reliance on Washington. The human cost of the war remained staggering. Hundreds of thousands of casualties, soldiers and civilians alike. Cities reduced to rubble. Millions displaced from their homes. Families torn apart. Children growing up in bomb shelters. The suffering was immense and ongoing. Europe, watching from close proximity, couldn't look away. The moral clarity of supporting a democracy defending itself against authoritarian aggression was powerful, but so was the tragedy of preventable death and destruction. Economic consequences rippled through Europe in complex ways. Defense spending increased dramatically, redirecting funds from social programs. Inflation surged, partly due to energy costs and supply chain disruptions. Some industries struggled while others, particularly defense contractors, boomed. The overall economic impact was negative but manageable for most countries. Europe proved more resilient than many expected, adapting to changed circumstances faster than pessimists predicted. The war accelerated existing trends in some areas and reversed them in others. European integration deepened in security matters, even as national interests sometimes clashed. Renewable energy adoption accelerated. Military capabilities improved. But faith in multilateralism and rule-based order suffered. If Russia could invade a neighbor with impunity, if the United Nations Security Council was paralyzed, if might made right, what did international law really mean? These questions troubled European leaders who had built their worldview on institutional cooperation. Looking toward the future, several scenarios seem possible. In the best case, Ukraine prevails militarily, regaining its territory and securing membership in NATO and the EU. Russia faces a reckoning, potentially leading to political change and eventual normalization of relations. Europe emerges stronger, more unified, and more capable of defending itself. The rules-based international order is reaffirmed. In the worst case, the war drags on for years, bleeding both sides while Europe fragments under economic pressure and war fatigue. Russia achieves some territorial gains, emboldening further aggression. China learns lessons about Western resolve, or lack thereof. The world becomes more dangerous and unstable. The most likely outcome probably falls somewhere between these extremes. A frozen conflict, territorial changes that aren't fully recognized, ongoing sanctions, continued military support for Ukraine, and a Europe permanently changed by the experience. The old assumptions about peace and prosperity through economic integration are dead. The new reality involves hard power, military strength, and willingness to confront aggression directly. What's clear is that Europe cannot return to the status quo before February 2022. The continent has been awakened to geopolitical realities it tried to transcend. The peace dividend has been spent. The holiday from history is over. Whether this leads to a stronger, more capable, more united Europe or to fragmentation and decline depends on choices being made right now. The war in Ukraine is changing Europe's military posture, its energy infrastructure, its political alignments, its economic relationships, and its understanding of its own place in the world. For the United States, these European changes carry enormous implications. A stronger Europe means a more capable ally in great power competition with China and Russia. It means burden sharing that American taxpayers have demanded for decades. But it also means potential divergence on strategy and interests, particularly regarding China. The United States must navigate supporting European defense while maintaining leadership of the alliance. American weapons, intelligence, and diplomatic support remain crucial to Ukraine's defense, but increasingly, this is a shared effort rather than an American-dominated one. The lessons for American military planning are significant. The war demonstrates the continued importance of conventional military power, the critical role of artillery and air defense, the vulnerability of modern militaries to electronic warfare and drones, and the decisive advantage that superior intelligence and precision weapons provide. It shows that industrial capacity matters, that stockpiles can be depleted quickly, and that the ability to produce weapons at scale during conflict is as important as technological sophistication. American defense planners are studying these lessons and adjusting procurement and strategy accordingly. The war also highlights the importance of alliances and partners. Ukraine's resistance succeeded partly because it wasn't alone. Western weapons, training, intelligence, and economic support made the difference between defeat and resilience. This validates American investment in allies and partnerships, showing that these relationships provide real strategic value when crises emerge. But it also reveals the need for allies to contribute more meaningfully to collective defense. As we look at how the Ukraine war is changing Europe, we must recognize that this transformation is ongoing, not complete. The final shape of post-war Europe depends on how the conflict ends, how reconstruction proceeds, and whether the political will to maintain higher defense spending and harder stances toward Russia persists. Already, there are signs of fatigue, of economic pressure leading to questions about continued support. But there are also signs of permanent change, of altered consciousness about security that won't easily reverse. The war has reminded Europe and the world of fundamental truths about power, sovereignty, and the costs of defending freedom. It has shown that geography still matters, that borders are worth defending, and that aggression must be confronted. It has demonstrated that democracies can be tough when necessary, that economic interdependence doesn't prevent conflict, and that the vision of history ending in liberal democratic triumph was premature. For young Europeans, this war is a defining experience, much as the Cold War defined an earlier generation. They are learning that peace is not guaranteed, that freedom requires defense, and that their comfortable assumptions about the world were built on foundations that could crumble. How this shapes their politics, their choices, and their values will determine Europe's trajectory for decades. The transformation of Europe extends to its sense of identity and purpose. Is Europe a civilian power focused on trade and diplomacy, or must it also be a military power capable of defending its values? Can it balance its social model with the demands of defense spending? Can it maintain unity across diverse nations with different threat perceptions and economic interests? These questions don't have easy answers, but they're being debated and tested in real time. In conclusion, the war in Ukraine has catalyzed the most significant transformation of Europe since the end of the Cold War. It has shattered comfortable assumptions, forced difficult choices, and revealed both strengths and weaknesses. Europe is rearming, reorienting its economy, and rethinking its place in the world. The old model of peace through economic integration has given way to a harder-edged realism about power and security. Whether this leads to a stronger, more capable Europe or to fragmentation and conflict depends on leadership, political will, and the ability to maintain unity in the face of ongoing challenges. But one thing is certain: Europe after Ukraine will never be the same as Europe before, and the consequences of this transformation will shape global security for generations to come. The question now is not whether Europe has changed, but whether it has changed enough to meet the challenges of this new era. Only time will tell, but the stakes could not be higher, not just for Europe, but for the entire democratic world watching to see if freedom can still defend itself in the 21st century.